to this week's episode of Ask an Expert. I am thrilled to be joined here by Heidi Wardle. And we were just before clicking go live here, we were just talking about how unbearably hot it is in both of our locations. So if you're tuning in and it is also hot where you are, we understand what you're going through and we will get through this. But Heidi, thank you so much for joining us. And we really can't wait to learn more from you about the topic of equine insurance.
Perfect. Yeah, I am happy to chat about it. I know it's kind of something that there's a lot of myths and stuff that get floated around, and people have, some misconceptions, and a lot of times they're maybe too afraid to ask their agent if they already have one, or they don't want to feel stupid or anything. But that's what we're here for, is just to answer everything. So I always want my clients to understand the whole process, because that just eliminates a lot of the problems that people can run into with their insurance policies. So
it's so appreciated. And honestly, insurance is one of those things I feel like it is purposely confusing so that we don't understand what's going on. But it's like a black box. It's just none of us, unless you're an expert like you, I think a lot of us just feel like we don't have a lot of information. So we really appreciate you kind of sharing that knowledge with us here this evening. Before we jump into the topic of insurance, we would love to get a bit more about you and kind of hear about your story, how you ended up in equine insurance, where you're based. Just get to know Heidi for a second.
Yeah, sure. So I actually, I got out of college, did the working student thing. I was gung-ho that I was going to be a professional rider, trainer, all in on that. And after a few years of doing that, realized it was kind of exhausting and kind of, tough to move forward in that and make ends meet and whatnot. And I just, figured there had to be maybe some way to still be involved with horses, but maybe not directly with the riding and training and whatnot, because obviously horses were my passion. So I just kind of happened across a job listing one night for kind of an insurance agency, an equine insurance agency. And I thought that could be cool. So that was kind of how I ended up there and learned about everything and realized it really was a good way to connect with, people and their horses and have that interaction with them kind of on a different scope than the, daily lessons and training and grind and, just be there to help them when things go wrong with their horses. So
that's awesome. And it's a much needed resource. So we really, that's really great. Are you hearing an echo on your end? Are you hearing me twice?
No, sounds good.
Great. Perfect. And it went away for me. So win-win. Okay, so let's talk about kind of the basics of equine insurance. Can you talk us through? I know there's multiple types. Let's start there. Can we talk about major medical, mortality, loss of use, liability, and kind of who these policies are best suited for? And that might take us the whole hour. So we'll see where that takes us.
It's not too bad. So yeah, basically the big one is, your mortality, your major medical. That's what most people are looking for. The base of the policy is the mortality coverage. So that's like your life insurance for your horse. And that is the coverage that basically you're going to be reimbursed X amount if your horse, it has to be euthanized or is stolen and not recovered. That occasionally happens. We don't see it often, but it does offer coverage for that. So that's the base of the policy. So in order to get any of the other options, you have to have the mortality coverage. So, a lot of people, they're like, well, I don't care so much, if I don't get paid if my horse dies, I just want the major medical. But that's kind of the catch, is you do have to carry the mortality coverage in order to get the major medical, because the major medical is an add-on. So being kind of the biggest add-on that people want is the major medical, and that is the coverage that's going to reimburse you for some of those veterinary expenses, which, these days everybody has them. And, what they really want to do is help you with the unexpected ones. So you can get different limits of major medical depending on, eligibility, anywhere from maybe $5,000 a year up to $15,000 a year. You can also just get surgical coverage. Some people, are only more worried if the horse has got to be hospitalized, or maybe needs colic surgery. Some people are like, I can cover most of it, but that colic surgery sounds really intense. We would like some coverage for that. So that you do have some plans where you can get just that coverage, which is a little bit cheaper than the whole major medical. Loss of use, you mentioned, that's another one. We don't sell a lot of it anymore these days. It used to be, and it's a great coverage in theory. If you think about the things that can happen to these horses, and sometimes, they get hurt, but it's not necessarily something where you have to put them down, but you may not be able to ride them and compete them and do kind of what you bought them for anymore. So that was what was always considered a loss of use policy. So you're paying for coverage so that if your horse is no longer able to perform that use, you get some reimbursement out of that. Now, these days, we have so many medical treatments that you can do to provide for these horses that are getting hurt. It's actually gotten a lot harder to prove that your horse can't do its job anymore. So those claims are a lot more difficult to work through. So we do still see some loss of use coverages, but a lot of times I would say it's more geared towards, some of those upper level, top dollar hunter jumpers, dressage horses where the mortality value is pretty high. People have got a lot invested in the competitive, abilities of those horses versus maybe the amateurs that, are just going on a much more local level. So that's that section of kind of the mortality major medical options there. We do offer, there's on the flip side, we have liability coverages for, commercial operations for your boarding and your training. Everybody is so worried about getting sued these days, and we all know horses can do crazy things that we have no control over. So we offer different packages for both commercial and maybe just personal liability. If you're out trail riding your horse and it, kicks someone or something and you get into a lawsuit with that, there is coverage for that. And those are usually quite affordable policies to take up. So.
Okay, this was that was really clear. Okay, so everybody, mortality coverage is kind of the baseline. And is the right way to think about mortality coverage for any horse? How is the amount that is paid out on mortality coverage determined?
Yeah, so normally, a lot of times we start with the purchase price. Obviously, you're setting the market value of a horse with your purchase price. So if you've just bought the horse and you're looking to get it insured, which is the best time to get it insured, by the way, you're usually going to be insuring it for that purchase price. Now, obviously, after you've had a horse a while, you've done lessons, training, you've probably invested some money into it, and it's maybe increased in market value. There's certainly over time you can look at increasing that value. The way I always look at it, some people like to insure their horse to its full value. And we always think of, oh, well, if I were to sell him, I would get this much. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what you're going to insure the horse for, because obviously the higher the value, the higher your insurance premium is going to be. So when people are asking me like, well, what should I insure him for? I just always ask back and I say, well, if he were to die, what would you need as reimbursement to replace him? Are you going to go buy another, horse at this level what he's actually worth? Or maybe you would go buy a young horse and you don't need as much. It's just a kind of a different comfort zone for each individual owner. So, whether you insure it to its full value or not just kind of depends. Obviously, the option is there to go higher, lower, but it's a reimbursement policy. It's not necessarily a market value policy. So, think of it more just as if you lose this horse, what are you out and what do you need to compensate yourself for that loss?
That makes sense. Okay, so you mentioned in kind of the beginning of this episode that it's common for a lot of horse owners to have misconceptions about equine insurance. What misconceptions come to mind for you?
I would say the biggest one, people always kind of ask, and I see people question on Facebook, they're like, well, should I report this? Am I supposed to tell them about this? And people will come back and say, oh, you don't want to tell them that because they'll never cover it again. They'll exclude it. And while there is some truth to that, it actually really depends. And when it comes down to it, the wording of the policy actually does require you to report any non-routine care. That doesn't say if you want reimbursement, it doesn't give you any parameters. It just says if the horse is having any non-routine care, you are actually required to let the insurance company know. You don't have to open a claim. You don't have to go through the process, but they do need to be aware that something's going on. A lot of things are routine, maintenance, hock injections and things like that. You're not reporting those. Those are routine treatments. But if your horse is seen for an abscess or an eye issue, even, something that may not seem too serious right away, you don't know if it's going to get serious though. So you want to let them know. And insurance policies these days are kind of, I'm not going to say on purpose, but their reporting time windows are getting smaller and smaller. So some companies only give you maybe 30 to 60 days from when an issue starts to notify them. And if you don't, you may not get coverage for that because you didn't report it in time. So if in doubt, just let the company know that something's going on.
Interesting. And is the reason people say not to report it, is that valid or is that not actually a risk?
It is and it isn't, because, some people will say like, oh, my horse was a little colicky. The vet came out, checked him, gave him some fluids and he was fine. And then they say, well, I don't want the insurance company to know that he colicked because now they're not going to cover colic ever again. That's kind of a common concern. And maybe the bill was only a couple $100 and you're not worried about getting the money or whatnot. But the point of it is it did happen. And that visit is going to be on your horse's health notes. And even if you don't report it when it happens, when you go to renew the policy, your renewal application is going to ask you, has anything happened this past year? You're going to have to report it then. It looks better if you report it at the time. You need to put it on your renewal application because if you don't, that's insurance fraud, more or less, because then you're lying because it did happen. And those, kind of omissions tend to come out at the worst time because if you report it and, obviously it's no big deal, the horse had a bellyache, it's okay. Usually, they won't apply an exclusion if it's just a one little occurrence that, was fine. But if it happens 6 months later and they learn that you didn't tell them that it happened last year, now you got some red flags going on, and that gives them cause to maybe not cover any colic going forward, where if you actually had reported it, they would cover it. It's just, it's not a perfect system sometimes, but I think it's much better to be honest and upfront and, disclose everything that you're supposed to. So, because not everything is going to be excluded. It's just going to depend on the situation. There's a lot of variables of what happens, when it happened, what all was involved.
Okay. What does major medical typically cover, and what are some common exclusions that owners should be aware of?
So as far as the major medical, I tell people, excuse me, to think of it as financial aid. It is not there to just pay all your vet bills as much as we would like it to. It is more of just financial assistance. it's supposed to cover accident, illness, injury, disease, lameness. And then within kind of that, different policies have different ways that they reimburse for different things. So it certainly, you do have to know what your policy covers. As far as within those things, we tend to see a lot of sublimits or co-insurances, particularly on lameness diagnostics and lameness treatments. They try to put more of the limitations on issues where you're in a situation where you don't necessarily have to treat the horse. You know, we love to give the horse PRP for, suspensory injury, but it's not critical that that horse has that versus, if your horse is colicking and it needs surgery, that's pretty critical, or has a joint involved laceration and they say, hey, it needs to be hospitalized and this joint needs to be treated. Those situations, you see less of the limits and restrictions. In the situations where, okay, he's been grade 2 on and off for the last couple of weeks, we've blocked it, maybe the vet's suggesting we want to do an MRI and try and see what's going on, but that's not something you have to do to diagnose that lameness. It's nice to. So that's where you see different limitations. I will say the most is on diagnostics, your MRIs, your bone scans, x-rays and ultrasounds. Some policies are going to only cover maybe 80% of those, or they're going to only cover up to a certain amount, maybe $2,500 can be used for diagnostics. They won't let you use your entire major medical limit on bone scans, basically. And then the same for, some of those treatments like shockwave and IRAP and stem cell. And these are things that have come about probably in the last 10 years or so where, the policies didn't have to have those limits before because we didn't have those treatments. If your horse did a suspensory, you ultrasounded it and, maybe you stall rested it for a little while and then you turned it out for 6 months. And that was, then it was healed. Now your horse does a suspensory, we're doing an ultrasound, maybe we're doing, a CT and then we're going to PRP and do a little IRAP on it. And then we're going to do more follow-up ultrasounds. And, it's just what used to be a $1,500 vet bill is now a $5,000 vet bill. And so the insurance companies just haven't been able to keep up with those costs. So they do have to limit some of those things in some ways. So the worst thing you can do when your horse is injured or lame is take it to the vet and say, he's insured, do what you need to do. Because the vets don't understand that there are certainly limitations within the policies there. So you want to know what you have coverage for under your policy so that you can decide what treatments, you're willing and comfortable and able to do for your horse in that situation before you get a big vet bill that the insurance company doesn't pay 100% of. So again, and that's why I come back to saying it's financial aid.
Got it. And thinking about the mortality coverage, since that's kind of like what everyone is getting when they get equine insurance, is there a specific like persona of the person or the horse that you think is the right horse to get insurance on? Basically, do you generally recommend a certain, like, if they're under a certain age or if they're over a certain value, they should have insurance? Or are you of the opinion that like pretty much any horse, every horse should be insured?
It's all up to the owner. I mean, I've found different people have lots of different reasons for insuring their horses. I've had some clients that used up their entire life savings to buy a horse, and maybe it's a $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 horse or a $5,000 horse, but that was everything they had and they wanted to buy that horse. And if that horse died, they're out their life savings. So for someone like that, it's pretty important to them to insure that cost because if their horse died, if it colicked and died, they would just be out that and they wouldn't be able to come up with that again. There are other clients that have, maybe some lower valued horses. They're not so much worried about that mortality. That they spent $2,000 on their thoroughbred off the track a few years ago. If the horse died, they're going to be heartbroken, but they'd be able to come up with $2,000 to replace that horse. Those people tend to be more interested in the major medical coverage and, trying to plan for, some of those unexpected vet bills that can happen to any horse, regardless of the horse's value. It really depends. Obviously, the cost varies depending on the horse's age and use. We do insure horses through age 20 right now, but from age 15 to 20, the premium does kind of climb every year, and it does get to a point where a lot of people in that horse's 15 to 20 year age range, they have to do some thinking every year as far as, do I pay this much in premium for the off chance that, my horse is going to die and how much I get. So, there's some of that kind of weighs into the decisions there. Some people have, when their horse gets that age, they've owned it for 10, 15 years. They're not so worried about the investment in it. And, it's less important to them than it was maybe 10 years ago. So,
yeah. So when you say there's people that care more about the major medical than the mortality, in those cases, do they just assign a very, or not, maybe not very low, but a low like market value on the horse in order to keep the premium for their mortality insurance down, and then they optimize for the major medical? Is that right?
in some instances, people do that. The different companies do have different requirements as far as eligibility for the major medical. So, a lot of companies these days, we're seeing that the horse has to carry at least 20,000 in mortality to be eligible for major medical. That's one thing that the companies had to start putting in place, so that you couldn't just, go so low on that mortality value and still get your major medical, because they still have to generate some premium. You think of everybody putting money in the pot, they've got to have enough going into the pot to pay out some of these claims. And again, you have to shop around and find a policy that's going to work. Some have that $20,000 minimum. Others, they just say, well, you can't have medical higher than the horse's mortality. So, if you want 7,500 major medical, your horse has got to be worth 7,500 mortality at least. So that's a common one there. And there are one or two instances in some kind of more basic medical options that actually are available to horses of any value. So I do have some $500 horses insured. Do they have the best medical policy? Not necessarily. It's not quite as good maybe as the $30,000 horses options, but there are some options. And again, that comes back to some of these horse owners whose horse may not be a very expensive horse, but they're still worried about, that colic surgery bill that they may not be able to afford, but would want to do it if the horse needed that. So that's where it's good to have, at least some coverage in place to help with that.
Yeah. Okay, that absolutely. So one member heard that if you make a claim under loss of use, the company could require euthanasia. Is there any truth to that?
The loss of use coverage, again, it's a little complicated when those claims do get paid. If you have that coverage on your policy, you want to read it very carefully, because typically how it's set up is if they do say that approve that it is a loss of use claim, they will typically pay you maybe 60% of your horse's value. But because they pay that claim, a lot of the policy wording does state that they can actually take possession of that horse because they've paid that claim. A lot of people don't realize that. Some policies have an option where if you take less of a percentage of payout, you can keep the horse, which a lot of people do, because the insurance companies don't necessarily really want to be taking in all these horses, because then what happens? Yeah, we don't really know what the insurance company does with the horses that they claim on a loss of use claim. So a lot of people, if their policy has the option, they'll take maybe a 50% payout on the loss of use and they can keep the horse. But again, it has to be, the proving the loss of use claim. I mean, that horse has to not be able to go back to its job at any level. If it's a jumper, it can't even be able to jump cross rails. But that's typically what happens is either the horse goes and stands out in your field and you get less money, or the insurance company takes the horse. So.
Wow, that is wild.
Read the fine print always.
Seriously. Yeah, absolutely. So as we talk about horse value and eligibility, how you kind of talked about how insuring your horse as soon as you buy it so that like the value is very clear because you just bought it at a certain price. How can a horse owner increase that insurable value over time?
So it's not as hard as it sounds. I mean, as long as we have forms that you can complete, and it basically is a way to put down, your training expenses, a list of shows. You can, if it's been going out doing rated shows, we can pull up its USEF history and show, that it's been doing things successfully. You can list out, money you've spent on lessons, it's gone away for training. Take into account all of those things. They're not necessarily going to give you dollar for dollar increase, but they look at the whole picture. And so like I said, it's called a substantiation of value. The more detail you can put on that, the better chance you have of getting your increase. Because all the underwriters see of these horses is what's on this paper. They don't see your videos and your Facebook and all of, the pretty pictures of the horse competing. They just see this paper. So the more detail you provide is better. So like I said, as long as the horse is healthy and sound and you can show that you've made that investment, usually the opportunity to increase that value is certainly there. And it can be done at any time during the policy period. It does not have to be at renewal, although at renewal is often a time that people kind of think of doing that because they're actually thinking of their insurance at that time. But yeah, the value is not set in stone. Some people go up, some people go down. It all just depends.
Okay. And if you have owned a horse for 5+ years, are you able to insure that horse, or can you insure it at any point after having owned it? And if so, are there different rules or limitations that come into play?
You definitely can. One question you'll probably get asked when you're applying is, why are you applying for insurance now? It's a little bit like, if you've had a horse 5 years and suddenly you decide to insure it, like what changed? And sometimes people be like, oh, well, he got hurt last year and I've got him back going again. And I realized, that this would have been a good thing to have. That's fair. Some people will say, oh, so-and-so in the barn, her horse colicked and she was telling me how much it cost. And I realized I'm really stupid not to have some coverage for that. So there's certainly valid reasons. It's gotten a little bit harder lately to get coverage in place if you've owned the horse for kind of longer than 6 months. We have several companies now that it used to be they might ask for a vet exam to be done just to prove your horse is healthy and sound at the day. Now they're actually requesting basically his health chart. So you would just have to email your veterinarian and ask for, the patient history. They just want to see the visits that the horse has had over the last couple of years to be sure that there's nothing weird that has been going on. And it just helps give them an idea of what the horse has been doing the last couple of years, versus that new purchase where you've obviously just bought the horse. Often they're going to ask for the pre-purchase exam, knowing that that's really the only kind of health summary that you're going to have of the horse at the time. So that's why there's a little bit of difference there. They're just trying to get more of the history on the horse. So, and a lot of people think, oh, well, he got hurt, I won't be able to insure him. Again, like I said, not necessarily true. As long as the injury has healed, it's all resolved, the horse is back to work and it's healthy and sound and going well. Obviously you may not have coverage because that might be a pre-existing condition, if it had a previous suspensory injury or something, but it wouldn't necessarily not allow you to get coverage going forward.
Okay. And if you need to make a claim, what does that process usually look like? What do horse owners need to be prepared with?
It's actually, so it's not as scary as it sounds. The claims adjusters, they're horse people. They're like you and me. I mean, they're working their job. And so you give them a call and you just let them know what's going on. They're going to send you some paperwork and they're going to reach out to your vet and ask for some paperwork from your vet. They're not necessarily going to dictate what you should do for your horse, that's your decision, but they'll kind of advise on, again, your policy coverages. They might tell you that, hey, if you have an MRI, you've got coverage for 50% of that cost. And then you're still responsible for paying your veterinarian. They're not going to pay the bills for you. You've got to pay those bills, and you will end up submitting your invoices to the insurance company. They're going to review that. They're going to review the vet's information that they send as far as what's been diagnosed. And they're going to go through and they'll reimburse you your covered expenses, minus any deductibles that need to be met. And then, once they have all the information, they'll usually send out a check, and it's usually not too complicated. Sometimes when there's timing things that get complicated, if you're working around a renewal date, there can be little hiccups here and there. As I said earlier, if something wasn't reported soon enough, you can have some issues with some things not being covered. But in a straightforward claim, that's kind of the process. And you don't have to submit everything all at once. If it's something that's kind of spread out over multiple visits, you can submit multiple invoices over time. It's not just a one and done deal. So, and your claims adjuster is kind of your point of contact throughout the whole claim. And, you reach out to them and ask them any questions, and they certainly help you when you're confused or if you're not sure what to do.
Are there any examples of common mistakes that owners make that can lead to denied claims?
Not reporting things is the biggest one. As we said earlier, if it can be an innocent omission to, think that, the minor little colic was no big deal, but it can come back to get you. Pay attention to your policy dates. It's a 1-year policy, and everything, if you're going to claim something, it has to be reported during the current policy. So again, and that's another reason why it's critical to report something when it happens. If you have something that happens kind of close to your renewal date, and it happens and you wait a couple weeks to report it, and then in that couple weeks your policy renewed and now you're into a new policy, you're not going to get any coverage because that happened on your previous policy. So very important to know the dates. Like I said, there's kind of time windows now that you have to report something. You can't necessarily wait till the end of the year to call something in. They may not cover it 6 months later. That's just, the timeline is probably one of the biggest thing that gets people in a bind there.
Yeah, I can imagine that gets to be a lot to keep track of as an owner. If I have 2 horses and they're insured with the same company, is it fair to assume that like my time windows to report things and are going to be the same because it's based off of the insurance company, or can my policy for 2 different horses have 2 different time windows?
Yeah, I mean, you need to check on each individual policy. The horses might be on the same policy and they might have the same dates. And so you might be working with the same terms for both of them. They might have different policy dates. They're not necessarily always on one policy. Your agent might have placed them with different companies. So if that's the case, they might have 2 completely separate coverages. So just little things to be aware of, look at the paperwork, check the policy numbers and the dates, and, make yourself a little cheat sheet if you've got a couple different ones, and with the right phone number to call, and, kind of the key dates on the policy there.
Yeah. Okay. Really great tips. I'm learning so much, and this is such useful information. Thank you so much, Heidi. Julia is asking, do you have any recommendations on appealing exclusions at time of policy renewal?
Yeah, so that actually happens a fair bit. We can't guarantee that we can get exclusions removed all the time, but often some of the minor issues, things that have truly resolved and enough time has gone by, oftentimes we can get something removed from a policy. It typically does require maybe a statement from your vet saying that the horse is sound and this has completely healed and gone away. You're not going to get things removed that are kind of permanent changes, things that are very likely to maybe reoccur. We're talking like arthritic changes. If your horse is diagnosed with kissing spine, hock arthritis, navicular changes, those are things that, yes, we diagnose them. We realize the horse has them. We learn how to maintain the horse for that, and, maybe do treatments and get it feeling better. And maybe it's no longer an issue, but those issues are still, those conditions are still there. Those are probably going to be permanent exclusions. Things like lacerations. I remember my horse had a severe knee laceration that went into his joint, and it was a pretty major claim. And so they excluded his knee for several years. But, when I thought about it, I said, his knee's totally fine. There's no damage. And my vet, wrote a statement, and they pulled that right off because, the nature of the injury was such that, the horse has been sound since then. It's obviously healed. The vet says it's fine. So that did come off. One that we're having a hard time these days is gastric ulcers. That's probably the number one claim that is filed. And it's so common and so expensive for the insurance companies that most of them are generally saying now, once a horse has been diagnosed and treated with ulcers, then any future treatment is kind of maintenance of that condition, that they're going to be prone to ulcers. It used to be that if they scoped clean after treatment and you showed that those ulcers were healed, oftentimes the companies would remove that exclusion. It's getting harder and harder now to get gastric ulcer exclusions removed. And if it makes anybody with a gastric ulcer exclusion feel better, most of the companies are actually dropping a lot of their coverage on gastric ulcers anyways. So the coverage for anybody for gastric ulcers is getting smaller and smaller. So
wow. This is wild. Okay. So how are pre-existing...
Everything you didn't realize you didn't know about insurance.
I know. I'm taking notes on everything I'm learning, and I'm writing an essay over here. Yeah, this is wild. How are pre-existing conditions handled, and can you get coverage at all if your horse is a known issue?
So pre-existing. So anything that has been diagnosed or happened prior to your current policy can be considered pre-existing. And again, I said current policy. So that means if it happened last year, even though, you've renewed the same insurance policy, it happened, before this current policy, it can be pre-existing. And no, they do not like to cover pre-existing conditions. So a little bit like I was saying with the exclusions, some of those things that happen and go away wouldn't necessarily be considered pre-existing, but a lot of those things that happen and are kind of maybe, now an ongoing thing, like, let's say, my horse this summer has been diagnosed with allergies, started getting itchy, hivey. We ran, now we're going to do some allergy shots and treatments. That's going to be a pre-existing condition and something that's, he's probably going to have allergies for the rest of his life, but we're just going to maintain that. The insurance company's not going to be willing to maintain his allergy medication on and on and on and on. So a little bit kind of the same as your health insurance when they say, pre-existing condition like a diabetic or something like that. Horses that have these known conditions and known issues, you're not going to necessarily have coverage for going forward, especially the ones that require ongoing maintenance. Think of maybe like a Cushing's horse or, stuff that just requires the ongoing treatment. You might have coverage for an initial diagnosis, but you're not going to have continued coverage for ongoing treatment.
Okay, got it. And as we think about beyond the horse, what are the options for insuring equipment like tack, trailers, and even farm property?
So yeah, a couple of companies are now offering some add-on coverage. Usually with the liability policies, you could get some equipment coverage. Now they're actually starting to add it in with some of the mortality policies. It's minimal coverage. It's going to help in some cases. It's not covering wear and tear on your saddle. It's going to cover, if your saddle's at a show and gets stolen. It's not going to cover, damage that your horses do to the water troughs in the field. But it's going to cover, if your tack room catches fire and all of your equipment burns down, you're going to have some coverage for that. As a boarder, especially, most people who own their own farms probably have coverage for those types of things, kind of more through a homeowner's or umbrella. But there are, again, some coverages for that. Farm property. Yeah, you're getting into, if you're a commercial operation, you probably have a pretty hefty farm property liability kind of comprehensive package that's covering a lot of those things. If you're a private horse owner, you don't necessarily have some of that. So those are the kind of people I think that more look into some of those optional add-on coverages. We have one company that I actually sell a lot of their add-ons in states like California and Florida, because part of their add-on is like an evacuation expense coverage. So they will, if your, county has to be evacuated, if government officials are actually declaring that you have to evacuate, and you've got to move your horse, the policy actually covers 10, 15 days or something of, your evacuation expenses, which, that could be a big deal if you're in a situation, out in California where, there's wildfires and you're having to move the horses, and your whole, everything to a different area for a little while until that's resolved. People don't think of some of the added expenses that can go into that. That's not just covered by your board. So, those are little add-on things that we're starting to see in some of the policies that can be really helpful in some situations. Some states, the evacuation coverage probably not as appealing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Taking us back to the horse for a second, Debbie is asking if EPM is a pre-existing condition.
EPM. So that is one of the more popular diagnoses these days. And it is a tricky one because you can have just very minor asymptomatic EPM, maybe the titer's just high, or you can have horses that are pretty severely neurologically affected. It a little bit depends, and obviously, we like to give them the treatment. A lot of people do go ahead, even if the titer just comes back a little bit high, we're going to do the treatment just to make sure. It used to be you had to do a spinal tap. Now we're just going off the blood work. You'll still get coverage, if it's a new condition, coverage for that treatment or whatnot. But going forward, because EPM can create so many different symptoms, a lot of times, you will get an exclusion maybe for EPM. Some companies will also include all neurological conditions, which is a little unfortunate. It's not a perfect system. I don't know that I totally agree with that in some cases, for some of those mild ones that never had any neurological deficits, but it's just because, you just never know with some of these horses that are diagnosed with EPM. a couple years later, they may develop those neurological deficits, and it is stemming from the EPM. So, there is no coverage for that. So, a lot of cases, if your horse has had EPM in the past and you're trying to get it insured, not necessarily going to stop you from getting coverage, but you're probably not going to have coverage for any EPM related neurologic type conditions.
Okay. Super helpful. So going back to liability insurance, what types of liability insurance do you think riders should consider, especially those giving lessons, hosting clinics, or keeping horses on their property?
It's actually pretty simple as far as the different exposures. We have similar to like where the mortality is the base policy of the mortality major medical. With the liability, the base of it is the general liability. From there, we have a few different add-ons. They base their coverage on exposures that are declared. So, if you're filling out an application for your commercial liability, you're declaring, how many lessons you're teaching, how many horses you're boarding, how many clinics you're doing, the clinic dates that you're going to be having. And those are all just usually covered exposures under the general liability. You can add a big one that we always recommend for anyone who has horses in their care they do not own. So if you're boarding horses, you have horses in training, you typically want to add the care, custody, and control. And it's an optional add-on coverage. It's not required, but again, it's a suggested add-on. And that's basically for you have these horses that you're responsible for that aren't yours. And if you are found liable for damages to that horse, maybe you left the gate open and the horse got hurt and the owner sues you for negligence, that's where you want the coverage for care, custody, control versus your just general liability where you have boarding exposure. That's just only going to cover, if a third party, let's say you left the gate open and the horse gets down on the road and causes a car accident, and now the driver is suing your farm, your business for the negligence and allowing that horse to cause the accident. So, and most of it is third party. You have a lot of contracts and waivers in place for the people you're working with. You want to make sure you're using those and protecting you. The liability, you do have to be involved in a lawsuit, and that's where, those policies are going to come into play. And you're seeing, policy limits of $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, which sounds like a lot, but when you think of what a lawsuit can entail, you can go through $1 million of coverage pretty quick. So
yeah. Oh man. Okay. So as someone who's both an equestrian and an insurance expert, what advice do you most often find yourself giving to first-time horse owners shopping for a policy?
I like to ask people, again, like what do you need reimbursement for? What can you afford? Can you afford to replace your horse? Can you afford, a pretty extensive vet bill? Some people, have a good savings and just want to make sure they have coverage, for a big colic surgery or something. Some people are just worried, if it just gets an eye injury, they're going to have a hard time. And when we're comparing policies, I ask people, if you had a lameness situation, how aggressive are you in wanting to diagnose and treat that? Are you someone that, does some x-rays and then says, well, we'll just rest him 2 weeks and then we'll come back and see, versus, the owner who's maybe this horse needs a scan right now. We're going to do the PRP. We're going to get him. He needs to be back in work in a month, because those are two different, benefits and what you might be looking for in policy is going to be different. You might want more of the gold standard, more expensive policy if you're someone that's going to do all the things and get the horse going right away, even if it costs you a bit more, versus the person who, is maybe not going to do those things, but is more worried about something really serious. And, if a lameness comes up, it's okay. We're not going to spend the whole kitchen sink, getting this figured out. But, if that horse needs colic surgery, we're spending the kitchen sink. So.
Absolutely. Okay. For pros or those managing multiple horses, how do you approach ensuring a string of horses or managing coverage on a farm?
The big pros are definitely a little bit different. That comes down to, a little bit how they feel in their business and their everyday operations. Obviously, for someone that maybe owns their own group of horses and has 5, 6, 7 horses themselves, you may not be insuring all of them. Maybe you're just insuring the ones that are out competing at a more regular interval. Maybe a lot of them are not quite insured to their full value. It really, that's where we just kind of have to figure out a ballpark plan, figure out a cost-wise where we would like to be. Some people, they have so many and they're, maybe their cash flow is fine that they're not so worried about the medical coverage, and maybe they just have some horses that they've imported or something, and they're just kind of worried about the mortality. Maybe they just have a mortality policy to cover some of that investment they've made, on maybe something they've brought over from Germany and they're going to sell. And if something happened to it before it sells, that would kind of mess up that investment for them. So a little bit of different, perspective there as far as how much they need to cover and which horses maybe they need extensive coverage on.
Yeah. Okay. That makes perfect sense. Well, Heidi, that brought me to the end of my questions, and I have learned so much from you. Before I let you go, I just want to open the floor to you. Is there anything that we haven't covered on the top? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot we haven't covered, but is there anything you want to make sure that we do cover this evening? Or any information that you just wish every horse owner knew about equine insurance?
Yeah, I mean, we've covered most of it. I think the important thing to remember: don't be afraid to call your agent and just talk it out. We're not. We're trying to help you, and we do know the ins and outs of each of these policies. So, sometimes I might tell someone like, yeah, in this situation, wait a week and see. Maybe you don't have to get everything rolling right now. In other situations, I'm going to say like, hey, you need to call right now because of this timeline and this time restriction on your policy. So don't be afraid to reach out and ask. As far as different policies, we get a lot of, well, my friend has a policy and it paid this and this and this, so I want that. I can't necessarily get you the exact same policy as your friend because you have a different horse, you have a different value, and don't just assume that just because Jane in your barn, that her insurance covered this for her, that your insurance is going to cover this for you. Every single different policy is a little bit different. So you just want to be real familiar with what you have, and don't hesitate to shop around for policies. And if you're doing that, don't just look at the bottom line premium. That is not necessarily the factor in what makes a good policy or not. They're not easy to compare side by side because a lot of them are set up on those reimbursements differently. You're comparing apples to oranges to grapefruits. So kind of understanding what to look for, looking for those different restrictions is going to be, one policy might come in cheaper, but it may not cover near as much as one that maybe is $100 more. It just depends. So certainly look at all the things and have that discussion with a good agent to help you go through what you need for your horse.
On that note, how does somebody work with you?
Very easily. You can find me on Facebook. My email is Heidi Wardle at worldinsurance.com. We just went through a big company transition, so unfortunately don't have a great website connection right now. So email is definitely the best way. But I am always happy to do free quotes for you, giving you an idea. If you're thinking, God, I have no idea what this might cost. As I said, there's a lot of variables. I have policies that cost $300 a year. I have some policies that cost $3,000 a year. It depends on the situation you're in with your horse, and it's a lot. Sometimes it's more affordable than people think. We've got some payment options, some installment plans. We try to make it work so that if we can get you some coverage, you can, because just having that peace of mind, for worst case scenario, I think is just so important. And, I think we've all been there in some cases when you're waiting for the vet to come out and you're just like, God, I can't afford this right now. Maybe, the insurance isn't going to cover all of it, but it's sure going to help. And so, something's better than nothing when you're just trying to do what you can for your friend there. So, that's always what goes through my head is like, well, at least in a worst case scenario, I'll have something to fall back on a little bit.
Absolutely. I think that makes perfect sense. And I know I have learned so much this evening. We have members in chat saying how much they're learning from you, Heidi. So thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your expertise with us. And thank you everyone who submitted questions. We appreciate you. And we will catch you on the next Ask an Expert. Bye, guys.
Thank you.